Hi, everybody. My guest today is the one and only Alisa Childers, former member of the Dove Award-winning Christian pop group Zoe Girl, turned apologist, author, and professional heresy detector. She's been making a lot of waves by tackling progressive Christianity, something she first encountered through a pastor at the church that she was attending. But instead of just deconstructing into oblivion, she dug deep, pursued the truth, asked tough questions, and came out on the other side with a stronger faith, writing books, launching a top-tier podcast, and warning the church about theological landmines. I first met Alisa in 2023 when she was an instructor at the Cross-Examined Instructor Academy. I've described her before as being a total class act. Kind, intelligent, graceful, and the type of woman you'd want your daughter to look up to. She is also, like my own wife, into crunchy living and fermenting her own food and drinks, so the last time we hung out, I mostly listened to a passionate conversation between the two of them about starters and scobies and probiotic salsa, but I still had some apologetics questions, so I figured, why not fix that with an interview? So you guys watch this, and I'm gonna go sip on some homemade kombucha. Alisa Childers, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. Thrilled to have you here, and wanted to speak with you about things that I personally consider you to be a thought leader, expert, if you will, in these spaces. You've had some successful books now, Another Gospel, Live Your Truth and Other Lies, and most recently, The Deconstruction of Christianity. And I think that these have been so compelling because you've had your own faith reformation. I know you don't use deconstruction as the term for your own faith journey, but you've had your own experience with that. You've lived it yourself. And I'm curious, what was the most surprising truth about God or Scripture that you discovered or rediscovered during that process?
Wow, what a good question to start with. First of all, Gregory, it's great to be with you. I am a huge fan of everything you're doing. So I'm thrilled that we finally got to do this conversation, which I know we've been trying to plan, and it's been crazy, but we're here. So that's awesome.
You're kind of busy. You got things going on.
A little busy. And I think my dog just came in, so she might be, hopefully she won't be too disruptive. But you know what I think was maybe just to pull something off the top of my head was the most surprising thing to learn for the first time. See, I grew up in a really genuine Christian environment. My parents did a great job of discipling me, but the one thing that was sort of missing from my upbringing, both in church and everywhere, was just this sort of giving reasons why we believe what we believe. And I don't think my parents could have foreseen that the internet would one day exist or that you'd need to do something like that. So I don't blame them for that. But there was just a lot of things I didn't know growing up that I learned as a result of my faith crisis. That was, as I appreciate you being careful with your words there. I don't use the word deconstruction anymore because of the way I define deconstruction. But it was intense time of doubt where I just didn't know what was real. I didn't know what was true. I didn't know if I could trust my Bible. I didn't know if God even existed. And so as a part of that studying journey, I guess you could say, I think the most surprising thing to me was learning that the New Testament actually contains what we might call proto-creeds that date back to way earlier than even the books that they're recorded in. So, for example, many people in our apologetics world talk about the creed that we find in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, where Paul says, this is of utmost importance. And he even prefaces it by saying, this is the gospel, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scripture, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Well, I think growing up, I just always read that as something Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians as part of the larger narrative. I didn't realize that he was actually recording for us a creed that went back to maybe 20 years before he even started writing that book, which was such a cool thing because one of the things that I encountered during my time of doubt was this claim that early Christianity was theologically very diverse and nobody could agree on what they thought the gospel was or who Jesus is. And then learning that actually we have creeds that go back to within a few years of Jesus' death, which in history is astonishingly early. Yeah. For me, I was just thrilled to be able to have material that was that early, because one of the things that really caused a lot of my doubts was it was in the context of this progressive church, and this pastor had said something like, well, it was just the theological winners of the battles that got to write the New Testament. So, they got to kind of erase what came before them and then make the story the way they wanted it to be. And learning that creed goes back to the earliest Christians was incredibly thrilling, but also very faith stabilizing for me.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I think that when we read the New Testament, we see the support for that with how many times Paul will say things like, you've already heard this, or I've already said this, or we've already gone over this with you guys.
Right.
When he's writing to these groups of Christians, because these were truths that were in that community. It was understood by everyone already. They did still need to be reminded. But obviously, these things were already being taught before these were penned, however many years after the resurrection of Christ. So what are some of the biggest positive results that have come from the books that you've written and your work dealing with deconstruction and progressive Christianity? I know sometimes we get a little overwhelmed with the onslaught of people who are against the work that we're doing in the apologetic space, but I think it's really rewarding when we get to see positive results of those efforts. So what are some things that stand out to you that make it feel like, okay, this is worth it? I can see God's hand is on some of these things.
Well, yeah, you're not wrong. There's a lot of haters out there, a lot of people
Right.
that don't like when you say some of the things. I don't feel like I'm saying anything all that controversial. I'm just saying things Christians have always said, but because of the way our culture is, I think people are extra sensitive to certain things. And so, yeah, I get a lot of negative comments. And it's interesting, isn't it, how you can have 10 just people weeping with gratitude for what you've said, but it's the one person that says the critical thing that can get, but that's all an opportunity for our sanctification. But I think probably the most common sentiment that I receive about progressive Christianity in particular that really encourages me and tells me, okay, I'm on the right track here. This is definitely something God is using in people's lives, is people saying, and I get this kind of a sentiment quite a bit through the website or even just when I meet people in person, but they'll say, I saw this, but I didn't know what it was called. I didn't have language to describe. Like everything you're saying is things I've heard, but I didn't realize it had a name and that it actually can be analyzed. And they just saw things that they thought were red flags. But because I wrote the book, it was like now they had language to be able to talk about it. And I think that is hugely encouraging to me. And then I've had a few, and these are probably the most encouraging, I've had a few people say that my ministry, my podcast, my books actually helped lead them out of progressive Christianity and back to the historic faith. And to me, that is just, I can't think of anything that I would rather hear. That's so exciting to me.
That's cool. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your podcast tagline, the end of that is to proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And I think you embody that remarkably well. And your compassion and sincerity are very obvious, but you also sometimes have to talk about really dark subject matter or things that are going on in the world that are really evil. So I'm curious to get your advice on what are some practical ways that Christians can prepare themselves to engage with modern cultural trends that might be kind of dark, but prevent themselves from being overwhelmed or compromised by those things.
Wow, what a good question. And maybe I'll think about this from a couple of different angles, because I think on one side of things, you have Christians who might, and I get asked this a lot, they'll say, well, how can I communicate biblical truth in a way that doesn't offend people? Mm-hmm. And so I think the first thing I would say is that you can't. You can't. You can say it with tears of compassion and love in your eyes, and people are going to absolutely hate you. And in that case, if you are being compassionate and genuinely loving, but you're speaking biblical truth, it's not you they hate. It's the ways of God. And so to Christians like that, I might talk about what Paul said when he said, we spread the fragrance of the knowledge of Christ, and to those who are perishing, it smells like death, but to those who are being saved, it smells like life, or maybe it's the opposite order. But that's really, I think, what Paul is communicating there is that when you live as a real Christian, when you say Christian things, you have a very particular smell to people. And in that context, interestingly, this was in the context of what was called the triumphal procession. So in the Roman Empire, Rome, of course, would go out and they'd conquer other nations, bring them into the Roman Empire. And what would often happen is when they would conquer a nation, they would parade the political prisoners through the streets, and then they would wave incense. So you would smell incense when the enemies of the conquered army, when the conquered army leaders were marched through the streets. And what the point Paul was making is that to the people who were the victors, the people who had just won the battle, that incense smell was, that smells good. Ooh, it smells like victory. It smells good. Mm-hmm. But to the prisoners who were facing death or slavery, it didn't smell so good. That actually smelled like death, but it was the same smell. And so what I try to encourage Christians with is that, yes, we should be winsome and persuasive and compassionate, but we can't compromise on truth because you're afraid that somebody's going to smell something bad. You are going to smell a certain way. And I think just maybe get comfortable with that. Now, on the other side of things, I have really tried to be very intentional and careful about the way that I engage with ideas. I love platforms like the Babylon Bee. I think they're hilarious, and they use in satire, and even our friend Melissa Doherty does that in such a good, effective way. Yeah. And I think that there's a great value in using things like sarcasm and satire and things like that to convey a broader point. And I think those people do that brilliantly. For me personally, that's not my brand. I try to avoid all sarcasm as best I can. My inner monologue gets sarcastic sometimes, but I try to temper that.
No.
And the reason for that, yes, not me. And the reason for that is because I have a very specific thing I'm trying to do. So I am trying to help the church discern these things. That's in my tagline too, to help equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity and discern its counterfeits. That comes before the proclaiming the gospel part. And in order to do that, I have to realize in my mind that there are going to possibly be people listening to me that might be buying into some of these ideas that don't realize it. And they don't actually want to believe lies. They don't want to believe something that's not the real gospel, but it's just maybe all they've ever been given. Or maybe they're like a frog in the kettle where their church has slowly drifted that way and they don't realize it, but they don't want to believe something wrong. And I would never want to come across like I'm making fun of them, because then that would isolate them and maybe they wouldn't listen to what else I have to say. So I think on a broader point, as a cultural commentary, that stuff can be very effective. But I just have this image in my mind when I put out a piece of content. And the reason for this is because this is how the content of certain apologists was for me. And I picture a lifeboat, because when I was in total despair, like I didn't know what I believed, I felt like I was drowning. And then when I would hear people like Frank Turek and Greg Kokel say really strong statements of truth that were very clear and what some people might even consider to be aggressive, it was like life to me. And it was like a lifeboat had come that I could climb into. And so I always have this image of a lifeboat. So anytime I'm sending a piece of content out into the Twitter sphere or whatever it is, I always think, is this strong and truthful? And sure, some people might think it's aggressive, but is it true and strong? And is it strong enough to be a lifeboat in really choppy waters that somebody could actually get into the lifeboat? And so I've talked about that on my podcast some, and that's the grid that I'm always thinking about. So if I'm thinking, oh, should I say this or should I not say this? I'm always thinking, is that a lifeboat somebody can get into? And you can't be a lifeboat if you're weak either. Lifeboat that's just made of some popsicle sticks is not going to make it to the person in the choppy water. So it has to be strong. It has to be true. But I also don't want to get to the person and then be like, you're an idiot. That sort of thing. Right. So, and that's another thing.
This boat sucks.
This boat is awful. But another thing that I felt, I also have a real heart for the normie. And like the normal person, because I'm a normie. I'm not a particularly scholarly. Nobody would have ever accused me of being an intellectual before I started what I'm doing now. And so when I first got into all this, I felt overwhelmed. I felt stupid. I would hear people debating evidentialism versus, presuppositionalism. And I did not know what those words meant. And I felt so dumb. And I just thought, I never want to make anybody feel dumb if they don't know what a certain word is, because I realize, like, you might be really brilliant with something else, but you don't know these theological words because that's not your world you're living in and swimming in all the time. So I always try to present the content in a way that's clear, easy to understand, kind, truthful, so that ultimately that would be a lifeboat somebody could get into.
Yeah. And I love that. And that's the driving force behind doing my channel the way I do is the same thing. When I was younger and had the questions that I had and I was seeking answers, I really didn't attach to what I understood apologetics to be at that point, which was, it seemed very, for lack of a better word, stuffy and very academic, and like it was almost intended to be over my head. Like it was very elitist from my perception of it. I know it to be very different in its modern form with guys like you're mentioning, Greg Kokel and Frank Turek. They really, Greg likes to use the phrase, throw the ball so that you can catch it. And so that was something that really appealed to me as well, and making my channel so that I'm not going to get bogged down in philosophical terminology as much as communicate the core truth behind it, which I think people can understand the concepts if you explain it in a way that they get it.
Well, and that's what you do so well. And that's why, honestly, I think artists make the best apologists, because think about it.
I'm biased, but I'll agree. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is what's unique about you is you're primarily a musician. You have this sort of singer-songwriter background, which is going to be presenting things in a way. That's what we do as artists, right? I have a background in music too. And I think every time I see an artist that's really passionate about apologetics, I'm so excited, because I know that artist in some way or another is going to be able to communicate those truths in a way that others maybe, don't. And it's different strengths. Like I look at a William Lane Craig, and I'm not even sure William Lane Craig understands everything William Lane Craig says. I'll never forget. He did this. This is maybe going on a rabbit trail. Going on a rabbit trail, but he did this post where he was asking people to write a haiku, but with this very specific parameters, and nobody could figure out what he was saying. And he finally just took it down because nobody could understand what he's saying.
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
So it made me feel better. That made me feel really better. But we need guys like that. We need the high-level intellectuals to give us the foundation for us to be able to take something and say, all right, here's how I'm going to help a young person understand this, or how would I explain this to my kids, or how can I make this beautiful for people to see, to really kind of shine light on this, to make it not just true and like a truth proposition, but actually something that's appealing, something that has beauty to it. And so I do think I'd love to see more artists get into apologetics for that reason.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so important, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the aroma, the smell of things being perceived one way by a certain group and another way by another group. And recently I had someone do a response video to one of mine, an atheist, and on it he was pointing out scriptures that he was saying were contradicting my claims. So for instance, saying that God was good, he was pointing to scriptures that said, where God said he created evil. And of course it was a translation issue where that original word didn't just mean evil like we might think of it, but calamity and woe.
Calamity.
And, horrible situations. And it depends on which side you're on. The curses that came upon Egypt, if you were one of the Israelites, that was a great blessing. That was what got you out of slavery. That was what convinced this evil ruler to let you go, and not just let you go, but let you go with a bunch of stuff. And it was a really good situation. But if you were one of the Egyptians, then those curses, they were evil. They were the worst calamity you ever experienced. And so whether you're on God's side or not really changes how you interpret those things. And so I think the perspective that we present to people, it changes their entire view of God. And we see that with these groups of, whether it's progressive Christians or, ex-evangelicals or anti-theists, when it's presented in a way that God is cruel, he's an abuser, he's, a narcissist. And when it's always put in those terms, well, then you get a very skewed version of him. And I've communicated to some people how, if you saw me disciplining my kid and I got pretty stern with him, well, if that was the first time you'd ever seen me, and that was your only experience with me, you might think, wow, he's not a very good dad. He's really short-tempered. And, well, But if you know the backstory, that I've told him to not do this certain thing multiple times, and maybe it's something that's very serious, like leaving the front door unlocked when his little baby sister could get outside and get lost. Well, then there's some really huge stakes that are there, and I care about it because I care about him, and I love my daughter, and I want them safe. And so it's coming from a place of care and concern. But if you don't know that, and you're only given the story that some kid, I saw him yell at his kid, man, he's a bad dad, then you're going to have a completely wrong view of what happened there and what the character of that person is. I think it's crucial that we present God well.
Or even like, imagine walking in on somebody slapping their kid's hand, but what you can't see from your vantage point is that kid was about to touch a hot stove and, something like that.
Yeah, it's better to slap their hand away than let them get the skin burned off.
Burn it off.
So on that note, or on that same line of thinking, what are some other common misconceptions about apologetics that you've had to clear up, maybe even among other Christians?
Oh man, so many. It's interesting because in the progressive realm, apologetics is viewed very differently than it is in the evangelical realm. So the challenges I've come across as it relates to apologetics in the evangelical church is people are just not that interested.
Right.
They just, they think there seems to be this sort of false dichotomy where people think that if you get too intellectual, that's going to stifle love, or it's going to stifle the spirit, or it's going to stifle faith or something like that. And I think that's a big misunderstanding in the evangelical church is it's very difficult to persuade people as to how important it is. Now, what will persuade an evangelical church in an instant is to start to sort of deconstruct their worldview. And you can do that through atheist role play, or even Greg Kokel or Kunkel, Kunkel. Brett Kunkel, not Greg Kokel. Brett Kunkel does even a progressive Christian role play that he'll go to a Christian high school and pretend to be a progressive Christian. And what happens, and I've experienced this, is when you actually challenge what they believe as an atheist or a progressive Christian, then they get really excited to learn how to defend what they believe. But I think generally speaking, Christians they're not really, if you just look at the best-selling books, it's all like spiritual life, the how-to books as far as having a happy life and things like this. So I think that it's just not as interesting to evangelicals. Now, on the progressive side of things, and I would say the deconstruction movement, this is big, not so much among many atheists, but in this one sort of sphere, it's like they think apologetics is just repeating talking points that defend like young earth creationism or something that totally denies science, that is totally unaware of the scientific arguments, that is just circling the wagons. And I truly think that's what they think it is. And I was actually pretty excited to see Wes Huff on Joe Rogan. I'm sure you've watched that because if anybody dared from that world to watch it, then they would see that this is, even if you disagree with some things he said, this is not that. This is something very serious. This is bringing together multiple disciplines of philosophy, history, archaeology, biblical scholarship to really analyze reality and give reasons for why you're saying what you think is true about reality actually is true. And I think West did such a good job modeling that. And hopefully that would help break some of those stereotypes. But I mean, I see it all the time in the deconstruction world where they owe apologetics. Like they think it's just like, do you think we're just still using that picture of, there was this fake hoax picture of a man's footprint and a dinosaur footprint that some Christian schools used in the 80s. And I'm like, that's not what this is. This is actually, you have astrophysicists and amazingly respected philosophers and historians and all sorts of different types of people from their sphere giving reasons why they believe God exists and Christianity is true, just like everybody else does when they give reasons for what they think is true. So I think that's a huge misconception in the deconstruction space. And I'll give you a quick example, not to take too much time on this, but
no, we're here to hear your opinions on this. So you go.
Okay.
You go.
Well, when my co-author Tim Barnett and I were writing our deconstruction book, one of the things we did as research was we met with several deconstructionists privately on Zoom. And some didn't want to meet with us. They wouldn't meet with us, but some did. And one of the ones that did, now these are anonymous. I don't want to say who's who because we told them we would keep them anonymous, but just use their ideas and try to help understand.
No.
It was Ben. Yeah, no, that's funny. So this one deconstructionist is one of those that particularly always presents apologetics as this dumb kind of. So I kind of thought, well, he knows apologetics then. If he's always saying how it's not satisfying, it's not good. It's not. And as we're talking, we talked for about 2 hours with him. And over the course of the 2 hours, like Tim and I are just doing very basic apologetics with him. Like, well, what do you think is truth? How do you ground what you believe? How do you know that Jesus is or isn't? Or what are your arguments for the Bible? Whatever. We were just doing really basic, I don't have faith enough to be an atheist kind of stuff. Like, that basic apologetics book. To the point where I was actually kind of embarrassed. Like, oh, he knows all this stuff. Like, we're saying this stuff and we're giving some reasons for the historical reliability of the Gospels at one point. And then Tim had to go. We were all on Zoom and Tim was in Canada, so he had to go. So he leaves me alone with this guy right after he introduces like the criterion of embarrassment, which is one of the historical reasons we think that they're probably telling the truth. Right. And I'm just horrified because I'm like, oh, this guy knows this.
Which, for anybody watching who's not aware of that, the short version is that the disciples wrote details about themselves that would be embarrassing in the Gospels. And if they were just making up a story, why would they paint themselves in such a bad light, Yeah.
Right. And their leader. Right. Like they're writing about this guy, they're wanting you to follow his teachings, but they're recording historical events where people are calling him demon possessed and drunk and crazy. Like if you were making it up, you probably wouldn't want to undermine people's view of your spiritual leader by saying people thought he was demon possessed.
And everybody thought he was awesome. And everybody who questioned it eventually agreed that he was awesome. And
Right, exactly. And of course, that's not like a slam dunk.
Right,
that's not the only, it's a cumulative case. It's just one of those things that we go, would they have really, it's just something to think about. But anyway, so he brings this up and then he goes off screen and I'm like, oh great, this guy's just going to be like, that's, I've heard that 1,000 times. So it turns out he'd never heard any of this and told us the next day he could hardly sleep. So here I am thinking, we're just doing the most basic, like you would learn this in an intro to apologetics class. So that was when it was very clear he has no idea what apologetics is because he didn't even realize we were using it with him. And so I do think that's a huge misconception in the progressive and deconstruction space.
Well, thank you for doing work to combat that. It's a good thing.
We'll try.
So still kind of on the note of deconstruction and progressive Christianity, there's a book, The Story of Christianity. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, by Justo Gonzalez. And he lays out a lot of the history of Christianity, how it developed and what happened throughout time. The first volume of it goes up to the Reformation, and then the second one is after the Reformation. But prior to the Reformation, he cites a lot of the writings of early Christians about how they preferred persecution. They preferred being persecuted because when they weren't being persecuted, nominal Christians in name only, would really flourish and kind of fill in the ranks. But then the moment persecution came back, those were the people who would betray them right away and be like, oh, the Christians are meeting over here, and rat them out. Right. And they were like, we prefer being persecuted because then we know who's who, and it kind of flushes the chumps. So, do you think that the current progressive and deconstruction movements in Christianity have a similar effect by weeding out people who were never truly committed Christians?
Wow, that's an interesting question. And I want to be really clear that all I could do is speculate because obviously God knows every single person's heart. But here's what I suspect. I'm not a 5-point Calvinist, but I do hold to the P in TULIP, and that's called perseverance of the saints. Sometimes it's wrongly called eternal security, where people think, once saved, always saved. And it almost sounds like you can just say a prayer and then do whatever you want and you're saved. That's not what that doctrine teaches. It teaches that if you are truly saved and sealed by the Holy Spirit, that's not something you can undo. And so you will persevere to the end. And that doesn't mean that Christians can't have times of living in sin or being confused or even deceived. But if you are truly one of his, you will persevere toward the end. So I suspect that progressive Christianity and deconstruction as a general movement, of course there are exceptions, is weeding out people who aren't really Christians. And if they are Christians, they will come back. And you do see that happen sometimes where people will deconstruct and go into progressive Christianity for a while. But then, like, I just interviewed a guy on my podcast who that happened. And,
Right.
and yet he wanted truth. And so he starts to realize he gets discipled and he's like, oh yeah, what was I thinking? And he comes back to historic Christianity. So I think he was saved, went through a time of deep confusion, and then came back. And I think that can be...
He was guitar player for Audio Adrenaline. Am I remembering
That's right.
that right?
Yeah, Dave Stovall for a band called Waverly, and then he played with Audio Adrenaline for a while.
Yeah.
And he's writing a book about all that. But so I think the general answer is probably yes, because what you see in deconstruction is people embracing a completely different gospel, one that is devoid of human sinfulness, devoid of the necessity of the cross of Christ, devoid of the resurrection, ascension, second coming, and final judgment of the living and the dead. I mean, that's just the thumbnail sketch of the gospel, right? And that's something that goes back to the first Christians. And so when you're denying that, you're believing something else at that point. And so where I'm hesitant to judge each individual soul, of course, I wouldn't do that.
Right.
For sure, what they've bought into is not Christianity. That I can say without question.
Yeah. It does seem to, especially when a lot of times they wave a particular flag, they are sort of labeling themselves, so it's easy to identify the differences.
Yeah.
So what's a question about progressive Christianity or deconstruction that you think people should ask more often but rarely do?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if this answers the question or not, but one thing I do see quite often that kind of frustrates me is, and I don't see it all the time, but it is not uncommon for a Christian to almost just act like, oh, progressives, they're just dumb. They don't read their Bibles. They don't know what they're talking about. They've never, and it's really not true. Mm-hmm. If you really think about it, most of the intellectual seminaries, most of these are teaching progressive theology. So this is not people who are just stupid and just going with culture. They are going with culture, but it's not like they just want to wear their skinny jeans and, be cool like Rob Bell. That's really, I think that's a dangerous characterization, because if that's what you think they are, then when you get in a debate with somebody who knows the Bible better than you do and knows all the liberal arguments too, it can be actually very destabilizing for your faith. So you have to understand that, and this is what I try to help audiences understand, progressive Christians are not stupid. They have reasons they've abandoned the historic gospel. And in many of those cases, it's because they truly believe that we are the ones that have hijacked the faith. And they're very sincere about it too. And I think that's another misconception that evangelicals have about progressive Christians, is that they're, the biggest question I get is, well, why do they still call themselves Christians? And I understand why somebody would ask that question. But the reason is because they are genuinely convicted that what they believe is right. And I think that's something that a lot of evangelicals don't maybe understand about most progressives. Yeah.
I think by and large, I think that would be the case. I do think when, like the Sparkle Creed, that kind of makes me think, I think you just like tacking Jesus onto whatever you're doing, and it just makes you feel nice to sprinkle him in there.
Because I did think the sparkle. Well, and okay, so that's a really interesting thing that you would bring up. So if anyone's unfamiliar with the Sparkle Creed, Google it. I thought it was a joke when I first read it. Like, I thought nobody would actually say this as a creed, but then there are video after video after video of progressive churches that are saying the Sparkle Creed as an actual creed, which it's ridiculous. But that is a good point you bring up. And so at that point, what I might do is differentiate between what, like when you see a video of a priest wearing a rainbow, clerical collar or whatever it is, and the BLM and the rainbow flag, and it's just like kind of obvious that that's what that is about. That's more the mainline churches. That's like the Episcopalian, PCUSA, some of those, ELCA, that are doing that. And when I wrote my book, Another Gospel, there was this crop of sort of quasi-evangelicals that hadn't gone that far yet, but they were just like starting to, like people like Rachel Held Evans, Brian McLaren. But now you're right, they're all kind of in that same camp. And so maybe I need to reevaluate my answer on that, because you may be right about that.
It's all good. But truly, to your point though, to support what you're talking about, guys like Bart Ehrman, he's a quote unquote expert on the New Testament, and He's very well versed in history.
He can debate
and,
any biblical scholar and know his stuff. Yeah, Pete
But
Enns also.
Yeah, with so many things, we're looking at the same evidence, but coming to different conclusions for different reasons. And so sometimes that's a misunderstanding of what that evidence actually represents. Sometimes it's because we're allowing our bias to skew things. And so it's very naive to assume that anybody who doesn't hold a traditional Christian view yet claims to be a Christian, that they just don't know anything, that they don't read their Bible or whatever. It could be that they're reading some wackadoodle devotional, primarily,
there are some of those,
and not actually based in biblical truth. But quite a few times, you do have people, like you mentioned, seminaries are there. There's quite a few people in those seminaries in positions of authority who hold those kinds of views. So it is wisest to do our own research and really make sure that we are properly informed in actual context, and that's the value of studying apologetics, so that we know these things, so that we can have those debates and productive conversations. So you mentioned in your recent book how the term deconstruction can mean different things to different people. So when somebody says that they are deconstructing, what's usually the first red flag that the way that they're using that word lets you know that they are heading down a dangerous theological path?
Well, and that would be my advice. If somebody tells you they're deconstructing their faith, the first question you should ask them is, what does that mean? Because a lot of especially the younger generation, they sort of see deconstruction like you're just making your faith your own. You're kind of busting everything down to the studs and making sure that what you've been taught is biblical, making sure it lines up with reality and with the Bible. And then you're constructing maybe your own views on secondary issues like eschatology or the gifts of the Spirit or predestination or something like that. And I think it's really important to ask them what they mean, because there are a lot of younger people that see it that way. Now, we would love to talk to anybody who defines it that way and ask them to use a different word, because the way that deconstruction is primarily coming into our culture is a deconversion from at least the historic faith. I mean, they say it in their title, ex-evangelical. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use the title evangelical to be a real Christian, but evangelicalism historically has been sort of the bulwark that's been fighting off other counterfeits like liberal theology that came in the late 1800s. So the ex-evangelical thing is sort of like, we don't care where you go as long as you leave that, as long as you leave, evangelicalism. And so, and of course, there's a lot wrapped up in that word for them as well. But I think that it's important to understand that if you go online and you go in that deconstruction hashtag, there's nobody in there except for like a random post of mine that somebody, put the deconstruction hashtag on or something. Most of the voices in that space are going to encourage you to free yourself from the bonds of biblical authority. They believe that's an oppressive thing that the church just uses to control people, is this idea of biblical authority, or perhaps being told that you're a sinner or that Jesus died as a sacrifice on the cross. All of these are seen as toxic and abusive doctrines, especially if you're teaching that marriage is between one man and one woman and that sex is only permissible within the bonds of marriage. I mean, these are the types of things that you're not going to be like accepted in the deconstruction space if you're like, hey, I'm deconstructing, but I believe the Bible is God's inerrant, infallible, inspired word. It's authoritative for my life, and I believe that there are only two sexes, male and female. You're not going to be accepted in that space, and they will just tell you. I know this because that's what they told me. I remember you hinted at this in the beginning, that I've sort of changed the words I use. When I had my faith crisis, I used to call it a deconstruction, and when I would talk about that, deconstructionists would say, no, you didn't deconstruct, and I would be like, wow, that's interesting. And they would say, you don't even understand deconstruction. They still say that, but I was like, well, maybe I don't. Tell me more, Right. And then I asked once, why do you think I didn't deconstruct? And they said, because you still hold to toxic theology. And I thought, okay, so there's more to this than just simply busting everything down to your foundations, building back out based on truth. That's really not what we're seeing happen. So I think it's important to understand that it's a very postmodern idea. The whole deconstruction, it's really more about getting rid of beliefs that you personally feel are toxic and harmful and abusive to you, and then constructing a belief system based on what you feel the most helped by, the most liberated by, the most freedom, And so it's all kind of based on your own internal moral compass, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's very individual. And in the deconstruction space, they're not going to argue with you about where you are landing. If you want to call yourself a secular humanist or even a Buddhist or a New Ager or New Thought or whatever, they don't care. As long as
it's not evangelical.
As long as it's not evangelical.
I could be a Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, or Baha'i and still be right with God?
Yes. Probably. Maybe, I think.
Or even an evangelical Christian, I guess.
No.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So now, again, though, the difficulty is that you have this sort of generational gap where the younger crowd doesn't understand that. And so they're using it more just to mean like, hey, I went to church camp and I really got on fire for the Lord, and I want to make sure that the Presbyterian view of baptism I was taught is correct. So I'm going to do a Bible study. And, that's not deconstruction. That's just maturing in your faith and testing all things and holding fast to what is good. And so it's difficult, because I would say don't panic if somebody says they're deconstructing. Just ask them what they're talking about. But here's a difficulty somebody might encounter. And this will happen quite commonly, where somebody will say, I'm deconstructing. I'm a stronger Christian now than I've ever been. I love Jesus more than I've ever loved him. I actually have a higher view of the Bible now. Mm-hmm. I have a healthier spirituality, a closer relationship with the Lord, and I'm stronger than ever. Now, most Christians would be like, oh, well, that sounds great. Awesome. But my advice would be to ask more questions. Like, well, what kind of beliefs did you get rid of then? And they might say, well, I'm just trying to separate my Christianity from maybe American culture that people are confusing with Christianity. And I think, Gregory, you and I both would be like, well, that's great. You should definitely do that.
Right.
But ask more questions. What are those American cultural things? And most likely they're going to say something like, well, the oppression of gay people. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, what does that mean? Because I don't want gay people to be oppressed either. But what does that mean, oppression of? And then it's going to get down to brass tacks. And what you're going to probably discover is that they think historic Christian theology is bigoted. They're going to say that it's probably racist. They're going to say that it's homophobic and that sort of thing. And that, I think, is what it can be so confusing, because it can sound so good on the surface, but when you dig down deeper, you're like, oh, you've just bought into critical theory, or you've bought into some sort of cultural narrative that isn't biblical, but you're getting rid of the biblical stuff because you think that's what the real thing should look like. So it can be very confusing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why, the postmodern thought is such a big part of that creates that confusion is really it's that framework of truth is something that is real and can be known. And so I'm pursuing what is the truth. How can I align my thinking with what is real and aligns with the way the world really is, versus how can I find something that placates my feelings and emotions and allows me the most spiritual comfort that I can get. I'm reminded of, my wife was talking with a friend of hers once, and her friend had stopped her in the conversation as they were having a spiritual conversation and said, your religion shouldn't be something that you work for. It should be something that works for you. And it's like, that's that thought of this should not be something that you say, all right, well, what if God really is real and he's the creator who made all of this, and he has his design in mind, and he asks me to align with that in order for me to be, most aligned with my creator. That means I need to know what his will is and make the conscious decision. Okay, I'll step that direction because that's what's right and good to do, versus, well, whatever works for me is what I'm pursuing. And I don't really like his particular plan or design. And so I need to recraft this so that it's something that is more agreeable to my senses, based upon my culture and based upon my own personal background and my own personal experiences. And it really is recrafting God in our own image when we do things that way, rather than pursuing the truth of who God is apart from us.
Yeah. And that's a very postmodern thing too, because part of postmodernism is really a denial that there is some grand narrative to reality that people could claim to know. That's why it's seen as really almost racist to send missionaries to another culture and say, hey, your culture is actually getting some things wrong, even maybe morally. Like that's seen as like, what? That's so supremacist of you to send missionaries over there to tell those people that. And part of the reason they see it that way is because they don't think you can know the grand meta-narrative of reality. That's very, baked into postmodernism, which postmodern Christianity is exclusive. Christianity is, we believe it's true for all people in all times and all places, and that it's going to bear the fruit of goodness in their life. And sometimes there are cultures that, maybe eating one another, and then they become Christians, and then they start, ministering to one another. And so in the mind of the deconstructionists, though, they're just going to call that colonization because of that postmodern sort of idea that you're just trying to impose your view on someone else when you really can't know these things. So it's hard. It's hard out there right now.
Right. Yeah. So I want to move towards a few music-related questions, and I think a good segue between these two would be that, and I know you've answered this question before, but you haven't answered it on this channel, and that's the one that matters the most.
That's the one that counts right now.
Yeah, but there have been prominent pastors and leaders in Christianity who now embrace progressive theology and promote deconstruction even, but it seems like a disproportionate number of Christian musicians and worship leaders have followed that path. So why do you think that is?
Oh, well,
I feel that.
Yeah. So I think that the way that the Christian industry is constructed is going to lend itself to deconstruction and progressive theology. And I want to be really clear. Like, I used to be in Christian music. I was in the weirdest time for Christian music. It was 1999 to about 2007 or 8. And right in that little pocket is when Napster came out. I don't know if anybody remembers Napster, but like our first album came out on cassette and CD. And then by the end, everything was digital. Like nothing was digital when we started. I don't even think that existed yet. But then throughout that time, somewhere in there, Napster was this illegal way you could download music, and it just killed the industry. It absolutely killed the industry. When we started, it was just this massive, they were spending, $20,000 on a photo shoot. I mean, just crazy. Now that doesn't seem like that much now, but it was, this was LA with like famous photographers, $800 jacket. It's just spending money out the wazoo because they were making so much money. And then during that time, not only did you have everything go digital, which killed the record sales, but you also had all of ours, for example, was bought by secular company. So I signed with Sparrow Records, but by the end it was EMI and now it's Capitol. So it's secular companies in New York that own a lot of the Christian labels, which I want to be very clear and say there's wonderful people in the Christian music industry who are very ministry minded. That's their goal and that's their heart. And I knew lots of great people. But just by its very definition, the whole thing is really, it's a business. The bottom line is you got to please the people in New York that want to see your business make money. Mm-hmm. And I think that because of that, there's not any accountability, or at least there wasn't. Like, I don't want to speak now because I haven't been in the industry in a long time, but between those years when I was in it, there's no accountability. No, I don't think anybody ever asked me to talk about if I'm even a real Christian or if I'm,
there wasn't a form to fill out.
There was no tell us your testimony or anything like that.
Right.
And we were given media training on how to avoid hard questions and how to just kind of give the broadest answer that's the most vague so that you don't offend anybody. That was very clearly taught to us in media training. And so I think you have a situation where there's probably a lot of people that maybe joined their youth band, worship band, maybe wrote some songs. They speak evangelical language and they can write songs that people will buy. And the other thing too about the industry is that, at least back then, it was all sort of surrounding radio. So you had to have a radio hit to sell records. I don't know if it's still that. It's probably not that way anymore. But you had to have a song that would be played on Christian radio. And to get played on Christian radio, it had to appeal to a very specific demographic, which was a woman, it's a hypothetical woman in a minivan named Becky. Becky's a soccer mom. She's driving her car. So Becky has to want to listen to your song, which means you're going to, of course, artistically, I just, cringe because it means you have to turn the bass and drums way down and you have to like mix it in a way that's really why Christian music, at least back then, sounded like a different kind of genre, because it was mixed for Becky. It wasn't mixed for like the cool rock radio that you might listen to if you were a heathen,
Right. We got to have that vocal right up front.
Yes, right. So there was also, not just stylistically, it had to appeal to Becky. It had to address the type of lyrics that Becky wanted to hear. And I just, in my short time in the industry, experienced that, where they're like, okay, this idea is really hot right now. Like, we had a song called About You, where the song's like, it's not about me, it's got to be about you. And they're like, this is the message people want right now. It's not about me, it's about you. So like all the songs right then. And like when I first came out, I wrote a song called I Believe in God. That was the everybody wanted to hear songs of like, I believe. And so there were like 2 or 3 songs even called I Believe at that time. And so now that's good. I'm glad both of those messages were popular, but it's whatever kind of the trends are that the music's going to then match the trends, or at least that's how it was. Yeah. And my concern is that as things trend more progressive in the church, well, that's where the music's going to trend. So it's not really about staying biblically faithful. It's about selling records, which you're going to want to appeal to the broadest amount of people. And I think that's where we see the watering down of all of that, which, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, is where I think we're seeing, I think it's more permissible to deconstruct as an artist. It's more permissible to become, more culturally friendly on topics like sexuality and all that stuff. And you couldn't have said that back. I mean, you couldn't have done that back in my day. Like, you were just kind of not supposed to talk about it. But now it's permissible to be, pretty liberal. And so I think so goes the trends, so goes the music. And then the music, it's sort of like this cycle, because the music influences the church influences the music, and then it keeps going. So I think that we see a lot of people deconstructing. Also, I think COVID had a big thing to do with that too, because people, when you're in the music business, what a lot of people don't understand is you're not making money from record sales. Like those record deals, the way they're structured, you don't make any money. I still have never made a dime from selling millions of records, Gregory. We sold millions of records. Right. I've never made a dime from record sales, and I've made mechanical royalties from writing songs and that, but not from selling a record. Never said a dime of that.
Yeah, I've got friends of mine that moved hundreds of thousands of CDs and
not a dime.
Never saw a penny.
No, not because every cup of coffee they buy you is going back into your budget that you got to pay back at a very small percent. Anyway, we don't have to get into all that. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because most musicians are making their money by touring. They're making their money playing shows, selling merch, that sort of thing. When COVID hit and they don't have that income stream anymore, I think it did cause a lot of them to reevaluate, like, do I really believe what I'm doing? It might have been like they were making a living, they had families to support. I'm sympathetic to that. But at that point, it's like, well, it's gone. So do I really believe this? And I think we saw a lot of deconstructions from the music business during COVID and post-COVID.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting how you were talking about the media training that you got when you were advised, don't rock the boat. Let's not offend anybody. Let's have these sort of morally neutral answers. And I think that could be still what's going on now. It's just that the society in general has a different opinion of what should be the least offensive answer. And I remember reading, I read a lot of musician biographies from famous musicians and non-famous musicians alike. And one in particular that I remember, this guy was in a band, and he'd gotten picked up as the drummer for a band that was already touring. And they found themselves on a televised show that was nationwide, and somebody asked them a question about reproductive rights. And so he was like, it was just the most panic-filled moment I'd ever had. And I had to kind of, knowing that they want me to give a pro-choice answer, but I'm not a pro-choice person. And how do I come up with an answer that's not going to get me kicked off this tour and keep my job?
Sure.
And so he's trying to angle at that. And I think it's interesting how a lot of musicians, when your livelihood, your album sales or t-shirt sales or ticket sales are really tied to public opinion. And we've seen how more and more now, I think a lot of famous musicians, whether it's, Taylor Swift or Paramore, these groups that can come out and, Pink boldly say, if you vote that way, you're dead to me, which is word for word what some of them have said. And they're putting complete trust in that this other political ideology, that's my camp, that's my group, and I don't really care if I lose these other people over here.
Yeah.
And so some people will do that, and then others, like Kid Rock and others, will go the other camp.
Total opposite.
And, yeah. If you drink Bud Light, then you're dead to me. But I think with Christianity, there's that push to be in that middle of the road, that I don't want to alienate either one of these groups. So how do I do that? And that's really difficult for you to do if you have a conviction to be a strong Christian and to adhere to biblical truth, because then you feel like even if I'm trying to just come up with the non-offensive answer, in a way I'm lying, in a way I'm being dishonest, and I'm not standing up for the values that Christ promoted, that I'm called to live out as a Christian. So I don't know, maybe a good way to say it is it takes a certain kind of person to do that, and a strong Christian ain't that person.
Yeah. Well, and also it's interesting to hear you say that, because you know how people always kind of joke that Christian music is like 10 years behind secular music. Maybe they are ideologically too, because you do see more secular artists, or for lack of a better word, artists that aren't in the Christian music industry, just being really more open, like, all right, here's what I think. And maybe the Christians are still thinking it's 15 years ago when everyone's like, oh, we love everybody. Just like, catch up, just say what's true. I don't know.
If you could have a conversation with Becky today, what would you say to her?
Becky, did we make you or did you make us? That would be the question. Like, did we form who you are? And what, like, how that can be the case? Like, is it the marketing that's made you want this product? Or did you really want this product and so we made it for you? I don't know. I'd like to ask Becky that question.
Yeah. It's like one of those time travel movies where it's like the guy is his
Did
own
we just
dad
make music that you got so used to that that's what you wanted? Or is Becky rocking out with other bands and then turns on the Christian radio and it's totally, I don't know. I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, Becky, I would encourage you to, dig deeper, deeper. I know those kids in the back of the van are loud and you just want something to drown them out, but dig a little deeper.
Yeah. I feel like Becky, in my mind, Becky is a little bit more, strong and street smart and has better taste and than we gave her credit for.
Yeah.
I feel like that. I think we might be surprised to meet Becky and be like, oh, you're actually not who we thought you were. Right.
No, she picked up a copy of Live Your Truth and Other Lies, and she's doing great now.
That's right. Amen. Oh, that's great.
All right.
Yes.
So some modern worship is criticized for being too focused on our own human emotions and not being focused enough on actually worshiping God. And sometimes even promotes false theology. So what songs would you put on a theologically solid playlist?
Oh, well, like specific songs?
If you can. I mean, I think that'd be great. I mean, the principles behind it obviously would be good, but do you have any that you're like, all right, this is solid, this is good, I recommend
like as a
people
modern worship song? Yeah, I just can't think of it off the top of my head. In fact, I just had to pick songs for the next Unshaken, and I picked one by Sovereign Grace Music. I think that I'm just kind of over the songs that are singing about how I feel when I worship. And I think for me, because it just throws me into existential angst, and you shouldn't have to, you shouldn't have to be doing theological gymnastics in your mind to make a lyric work when it's corporate worship. Yeah. I just think for corporate worship, it should be very, like, I actually don't think it's wrong to do repetitive, and simple chords. Like people, oh, it's 4 chords. Yeah, it's 4 chords because not everybody's a musician.
Getting salty.
And not everybody can follow like a really complicated melody line. So yeah, it's simple and it's repetitive because we're trying to have people sing along. Yeah. But I I don't know if I could come up with specific examples on the fly. I'd have to think about it. But I mean, most hymns I think are good. I'm not a hymn snob though. My dad was one of those hippies that were singing Jesus songs. So I've got too much of that in my blood to think each generation does have a way of expressing their worship to God that I think God, is pleased with. But yeah, songs that are singing about how I feel when I worship or singing about me as a worshiper, those just really bug me. And I wish we could get away from it.
Yeah, I agree. And my wife totally relates with you. She's pointed out on a few different songs where she's like, that's not me. That lyric is so specific to whoever wrote that. And I don't feel like I can honestly sing that. It's kind of weird, honestly. So I think that's a factor for sure. But go ahead. I'm sorry to put you on the spot with that. Put together a list, and then next time you're on here, we'll have your.
We'll do it.
Cool. So you did regularly tour and record. Which, speaking of good worship songs to check out, Alisa does have an album that she recorded recently of music that you can get on her website. I'll provide a link for that in the description. But you used to regularly record and tour with the band Zoe Girl, which we talked about a little bit earlier. But do you ever miss performing live and touring like that? Or do you find all that creative fulfillment in your current ministry?
I do miss singing. I don't miss touring. Touring was a very hard life that I didn't thrive in. The rhythm of touring was very hard for me. I didn't do well. I do miss singing. And I get very excited when I get the opportunity to sing in a scenario where it's done with excellence. I don't miss singing with a karaoke box on a street corner or but when it's with excellence, you have a good system, good people that are helping run the sound and
great drummer behind you.
That's right. I do miss that. I do. I don't know if I've ever fully experienced the fullness of that though, because even in Zoe Girl, and I've talked about this before, but that wasn't really my style of music.
Right.
What we did in Zoe Girl, that was a very specific thing for a specific purpose, but that wasn't really artistically fulfilling for me in every way. In some ways it was. We had amazing people we got to work with and they were so talented, but it just wasn't the style of music I would have naturally done had it just been totally up to me. And so I think this last album that you mentioned is probably the closest I've gotten to that, but I haven't really, maybe a couple of times I've gotten to perform the songs in a way that was like, wow, that was really cool. And, but that's something I surrendered to the Lord a long time ago. And I am very fulfilled in what the Lord has called me to do. It's a totally different side of the brain. Like people ask me to lead worship and speak. And I've learned that's very hard for me because one mode is very different than the other mode. And to switch back and forth on the fly is not easy. So it's like, just do one or the other is generally what I do now, but I do miss it. But I am fulfilled.
Great. Well, super thankful for your ministry and all that you do, and thankful to know you.
Oh, same here. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks again to my guest, Alisa Childers. You can visit her website, alisachilders.com, which I will link in the description below, to get more information on her podcast, her books, and music. And remember, eternity is on the line, and that lasts forever. I hope you choose wisely and keep on thinking to infinity.